When 8-year-old Sofia approached tech billionaire Alexander Hayes outside Chicago's most exclusive hospital, she had no idea that her desperate 3-word question would not only save her dying mother's life, but completely transform the heart of a man who had spent decades building walls around his emotions. What happened next left an entire medical team in tears and changed everything both of them thought they knew about family, love, and the true meaning of wealth. The November rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse boardroom. As Alexander Hayes stared out at the Chicago skyline, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. At 42, he commanded a technology empire worth $3.2 billion. Built from a small software company he'd started in his garage 15 years earlier. His days were measured in quarterly reports, acquisition deals, and board meetings that determined the livelihoods of thousands of employees across 3 continents. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Alexander had always found comfort in numbers. They were predictable, logical, controllable. Unlike people. Unlike the messy, unpredictable world of human emotions that he'd learned to navigate with the same cold precision he applied to business negotiations. His corner office at Hayes Technologies was a monument to success. Awards lined the walls. Expensive art carefully curated by an interior designer, and not a single personal photograph in sight. "Mr. Hayes," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "your car is waiting downstairs. The quarterly board meeting starts in 40 minutes. Alexander straightened his $3,000 Italian suit and gathered his leather portfolio. The board meeting would be routine, another record-breaking quarter, another victory to add to his growing list of accomplishments. At 42, he had everything most people dreamed of: unlimited wealth, global influence, the respect of his peers, and the freedom to do whatever he wanted. But as he walked toward the elevator, Alexander couldn't shake the hollow feeling that had been growing stronger each day. Success, he discovered, was a lonely mountaintop. The higher he climbed, the fewer people could follow, until he found himself surrounded by employees, advisors, and acquaintances, but no one who truly knew him. No one who cared about Alexander the person rather than Alexander the billionaire. Elevator descended toward the underground parking garage where his driver waited with the black Mercedes. It was a routine he'd followed 1,000 times before office to car, to meeting to restaurant, to penthouse apartment. A carefully orchestrated life that kept him insulated from the unpredictable chaos of the real world. But today, fate had other plans. As Alexander emerged from the elevator into the parking garage, he realized he'd forgotten his phone in the office. Rather than call his assistant, he decided to walk the 2 blocks to the medical district where his board meeting was being held at. Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Hayes Technologies was considering a major investment in medical AI, and the board wanted to tour the facilities. It was a decision that would change everything. The rain had intensified as Alexander stepped onto the sidewalk, pulling his coat tighter against the Chicago wind. He'd walked maybe 50 yards when he heard it, a small voice, barely audible above the traffic and rain. "Excuse me, sir." Alexander's first instinct was to keep walking. He'd learned long ago that stopping to engage with strangers on city streets usually led to requests for money, time, or attention he didn't want to give. But something about the voice made him pause and turn around. Standing behind him was a little girl, no more than 8 years old, soaking wet from the rain. Her dark hair was plastered to her head, her thin jacket clearly inadequate against the November cold. But it was her eyes that stopped Alexander, cold, large, brown, and filled with a desperation that was far too mature for her young face. "Sir," she said again, her voice trembling but determined, "could you save my dying mom?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. In all his years of business negotiations, hostile takeovers, and high-stakes meetings, No one had ever asked him anything so direct, so vulnerable, so completely outside the realm of spreadsheets and profit margins. For a moment, Alexander stood frozen on the sidewalk, rain dripping from his expensive coat, staring at this small girl who had just shattered his carefully controlled world with 3 simple words. Every instinct told him to apologize politely and keep walking. This wasn't his problem. He had a board meeting to attend, important decisions to make, an empire to run. But something in her eyes, a flicker of hope, mixed with the kind of desperation that comes from having nowhere else to turn, made it impossible to walk away. "What's your name?" Alexander heard himself asking, crouching down to her eye level, not caring that his $3,000 suit was getting soaked by the rain. "Sofia," the little girl whispered, wiping rain from her eyes with the back of her small hand. "My name is Sofia Morales, and my mama is dying upstairs in that big hospital." She pointed toward Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the same building, where Alexander was supposed to be attending his board meeting in 20 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been planning to tour medical facilities as a potential investment opportunity, never imagining he'd encounter someone who desperately needed those very services. "Sofia," Alexander repeated gently, surprised by the tenderness in his own voice. "Tell me about your mama." The floodgates opened. Sofia's words tumbled out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for too long. Her mother, Elena Morales, was only 28 years old and had been battling a rare form of leukemia for 8 months. They'd moved to Chicago from a small town in Mexico when Sofia was 5, after Elena's husband, Sofia's father, had died in a construction accident. Elena worked 2 jobs to support them, cleaning offices at night and watching neighborhood children during the day. "The doctors say Mama needs a special treatment," Sofia explained, her small voice steady despite the tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "But we don't have insurance, and it costs more money than we'll ever have. They said without it, she only has a few weeks left." Alexander felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built so carefully over the years to protect himself from exactly this kind of raw human need. In his world, problems were solved with contracts and negotiations. People approached him with business proposals, not life or death pleas from children standing in the rain. "Where's your family, Sofia? Your grandparents, aunts and uncles?" "It's just me and Mama," Sofia said simply. "We don't have anybody else. The neighbors sometimes help, but they don't have much money either. Mrs. Garcia from downstairs watches me when Mama has to go to the hospital, but she can't afford to help with the medicine." Alexander glanced at his watch. His board meeting had started 5 minutes ago. 12 of the most powerful people in Chicago's business community were sitting in a conference room waiting for him, discussing investments that could shape the future of medical technology. But he couldn't move. This 8-year-old girl had somehow anchored him to this spot on the sidewalk with nothing but honesty and desperation. "Sofia, how did you know to find me? How did you even know who I am?" A slight blush crept across Sofia's wet cheeks. "I've been standing outside this hospital every day for 2 weeks, asking people for help. Most people just walk by really fast and don't look at me. But yesterday, I saw your picture in a magazine that someone dropped. It said you were the richest man in Chicago and that you help sick people with your computer company." Alexander's heart sank. The magazine had likely been covering Hayes Technologies' potential expansion into medical, a calculated business move that had nothing to do with actually helping individual patients. But to Sofia, it had represented hope. "I know you probably can't help," Sofia continued, her voice getting smaller, "but Mama always told me that if you need something important, you should ask for it clearly and politely. So I've been waiting here, hoping I might see you." The simplicity of her logic was devastating. While Alexander had spent years surrounded by people who approached him with elaborate presentations and complex proposals, This child had simply waited in the rain because she believed in asking directly for what she needed. "Sofia, take me too." "Your mother," Alexander said, making a decision that surprised even him. Sofia's eyes widened. "Really? You'll come meet Mama?" "Yes, but first." Alexander pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. "Margaret, I need you to reschedule the board meeting. Something urgent has come up." He paused, looking down at Sofia's hopeful face. "Actually, cancel all my meetings. For the rest of the day." As they walked toward the hospital entrance, Sofia slipped her small, cold hand into Alexander's. The gesture was so natural, so trusting, that it nearly stopped him in his tracks. When was the last time someone had touched him without wanting something in return? When had anyone shown him simple human affection that wasn't calculated or strategic? "Mr. Alexander," Sofia said as they approached the hospital doors, "I should tell you something. Mama doesn't know I've been asking people for help. She thinks I go to the park after school. She's proud and she doesn't like asking for things. But I heard the doctors talking, and I know she's getting sicker." The automatic doors slid open, revealing the sterile brightness of the hospital lobby. Alexander had been in this building dozens of times for business meetings, charity galas, and board presentations. But walking through those doors holding Sofia's hand, seeing the space through her eyes as a place where her mother was fighting for her life, everything looked different. "Room 847, Sofia whispered as they approached the elevator bank. "That's where Mama is." As the elevator climbed toward the 8th floor, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine nervousness. Not the calculated tension of a high-stakes business negotiation, but the authentic uncertainty of not knowing what he would find, or whether he could actually help. For the first time in decades, Alexander Hayes was about to enter a situation where his wealth and influence might not be enough, where success would be measured not in profit margins or market share, but in something far more precious and fragile: a little girl's hope and a mother's life. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a corridor that would change everything Alexander thought he knew about himself. Room 847 was small and sterile, filled with the steady beeping of monitors and the antiseptic smell that seemed to permeate every hospital Alexander had ever visited. But what struck him most was the woman lying in the narrow bed. Elena Morales looked far too young and vibrant to be fighting for her life, despite the IV lines and the obvious exhaustion etched on her face. Elena's eyes sparkled with the same determination Alexander had seen in Sofia. When she spotted her daughter in the doorway, her entire face transformed with a smile so radiant it seemed to light up the entire room. "Mia, you're back early from the park," Elena said in accented English, struggling to sit up straighter. Then her gaze shifted to Alexander, and confusion flickered across her features. "Sofia, who is your friend?" Sofia looked nervously between her mother and Alexander. "Mama, this is Mr. Alexander. He wanted to meet you." Alexander stepped forward, removing his expensive coat and extending his hand to Elena. "Mrs. Morales, I'm Alexander Hayes. Sofia and I met outside, and she told me about your situation. I wanted to see if there might be some way I could help." Elena's eyes widened with recognition, not of Alexander personally, but of his obvious wealth. His suit, his watch, his entire bearing screamed privilege and power. Her expression immediately shifted to one of polite but firm dignity. "Mr. Hayes, that's very kind of you, but we don't accept charity," Elena said gently but firmly. "Sofia, you shouldn't have bothered this gentleman with our problems." The next hour was a delicate dance. Alexander found himself in completely unfamiliar territory, trying to offer help to someone who was too proud to accept it. Elena answered his questions about her condition with grace and honesty, but consistently deflected his offers of assistance. She explained her illness matter-of-factly: acute lymphoblastic leukemia, Discovered 8 months ago. Treatable but requiring expensive targeted therapy that her limited insurance wouldn't cover. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The doctors have been wonderful, Elena said, her hand resting protectively on Sofia's shoulder. They've done everything they can with what we have. Sometimes life gives us challenges we have to face with dignity. Alexander had never met anyone like Elena Morales. In his world, people either desperately wanted his money or pretended they didn't need it while angling for it anyway. But Elena seemed genuinely content to face her terminal diagnosis with grace, rather than compromise her principles by accepting help from a stranger. When visiting hours ended, Alexander walked Sofia and Elena's neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, back to their apartment building in Pilsen, a working-class neighborhood 30 minutes from his penthouse. The contrast was stark: cracked sidewalks instead of marble lobbies, corner bodegas instead of exclusive restaurants, small apartments filled with families instead of empty mansions filled with expensive art. "Thank you for visiting Mama," Sofia whispered as they reached her building. She smiled more today than she has in weeks. Driving back to his penthouse that evening, Alexander couldn't shake the encounter. He'd offered to pay for Elena's treatment, to arrange for the best specialists, to transfer her to a private facility. Elena had politely but firmly declined everything, thanking him for his kindness, but insisting that they would find their own way. That night, Alexander did something he rarely did. He couldn't concentrate on work. Instead, he found himself researching Elena's condition, learning about treatment options, survival rates, and the brutal reality of medical bankruptcy that affected thousands of families like the Morales. For the first time in years, numbers on a screen weren't abstract data points. They represented Sofia's mother, a woman who worked 2 jobs and faced death with more dignity than most people faced. Minor inconveniences. Over the next 2 weeks, Alexander found himself driving past Northwestern Memorial Hospital every day, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sofia. He told himself he just wanted to check on their situation, but the truth was more complicated. The encounter had awakened something in her, sense of purpose that had nothing to do with quarterly profits or market domination. His assistant, Margaret, noticed the change immediately. "Mr. Hayes, you've been distracted lately. Is everything all right with the medical AI acquisition?" Alexander realized he'd barely thought about the business deal since meeting Sofia. "Margaret, I need you to research something for me. Quietly. I want to know everything about acute lymphoblastic leukemia treatment options, the best specialists in the country, and what it would take to establish a patient advocacy fund at Northwestern Memorial. Is this related to a new business venture, sir?" Alexander paused, staring out his office window toward the hospital district. "No, Margaret, this is personal." But Elena's pride presented a problem Alexander had never encountered in business. How do you help someone who refuses to be helped? How do you save someone who won't let you? In boardrooms, Alexander could negotiate, leverage, and find mutually beneficial solutions. But Elena Morales operated by a different set of rules, ones that prioritized dignity over survival, principles over pragmatism. The more Alexander thought about Elena and Sofia, the more he realized how empty his own life had become. He had everything money could buy, but Elena, dying and broke, had something he'd lost years ago: the love of someone who needed her, the satisfaction of living for something beyond herself, the quiet dignity that came from facing adversity without compromising your values. 3 weeks after their first meeting, Alexander made a decision that would have surprised anyone who knew him. He was going to find a way to help Elena Morales, but not as Alexander Hayes, the billionaire. He was going to help her as simply Alexandra, man who had been changed by meeting a little girl in the rain, and her remarkable mother, who faced death with more grace than he'd ever faced success. But first, he needed to figure out how to get around the strongest will he'd ever encountered, that of a dying woman who refused to let a stranger save her life. The solution came to Alexander at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after his last encounter with Elena and Sofia. He'd been lying awake again, thinking about Elena's quiet dignity and Sofia's unwavering hope, when inspiration struck. If Elena wouldn't accept charity from Alexander Hayes, the billionaire, maybe she would accept opportunity from Alex Martinez, a man looking for help with a very different kind of problem. Alexander spent the next morning crafting the most important deception of his life. He traded his $3,000 suits for jeans and a simple sweater, left his Mercedes in the garage, and took the L train to Pilsen. At 2:30 p.m., he positioned himself outside Sofia's elementary school, hoping his gamble would pay off. When Sofia emerged from the school building, scanning the crowd of parents and caregivers, Alexander stepped forward nervously. "Sofia? It's me, Alexander, from the hospital." Sofia's face lit up with recognition and something that looked like relief. "Mr. Alexander, I hoped I'd see you again. How did you know where my school was?" "I remembered you mentioning the name," Alexander lied smoothly. "Sofia, I was wondering if I could ask you and your mother for help with something." Sofia tilted, her head curious. "You want our help?" "Yes, you see, I've been thinking a lot about what your mother said about facing challenges with dignity. And I realized I have a challenge of my own that I don't know how to handle." As they walked towards Sofia's apartment building, Alexander explained his carefully constructed story. He told Sofia that he was a businessman who had recently lost his own mother to cancer, and the experience had left him feeling lost and purposeless. He was considering starting a foundation to help families facing medical crises, but he didn't know where to begin or how to do it right. "I need someone to help me understand what families really need," Alexander said as they climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. "Someone who's been through this and can teach me how to help without taking away people's dignity. I was hoping your mother might be willing to consult for me as a job, not as charity." Sofia's eyes grew wide. "You want to hire Mama? If she's interested, I'd pay her fairly for her time and advice. And maybe she could help me understand how to create programs that actually help people instead of just making rich people feel good about themselves." When they reached apartment 3B, Sofia practically bounced with excitement as she unlocked the door. Mama, Mr. Alexander is here, and he has a job for you." Elena appeared from the small kitchen, wearing a colorful headscarf that couldn't quite hide the effects of her recent chemotherapy. She looked thinner than Alexander remembered, but her smile was just as radiant as before. "Mr. Hayes," she said with gentle surprise, "this is unexpected. Sofia says something about a job?" Alexander had rehearsed this moment dozens of times. But standing in Elena's small, immaculately clean living room, surrounded by Sofia's schoolwork and family photos, he almost lost his nerve. Everything about this deception went against his nature. He was used to being direct, powerful, in control. But something about Elena's quiet strength made him want to be worthy of her respect, not just demand it through wealth. "Mrs. Morales, please call me Alex. And yes, I'm hoping you might consider helping me with a project." Over the next hour, sitting at Elena's small kitchen table sharing coffee and homemade cookies, Alexander laid out his proposal. He explained that he wanted to start a foundation that would provide medical support to families like hers, but he was concerned about doing it wrong, about creating programs that wounded people's pride rather than genuinely helping them. "I need someone who understands both sides," Alexander said carefully. "Someone who knows what it's like to need help, but also values independence. I'd like to hire you as a consultant to help me design programs that preserve dignity while providing real assistance." Elena listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about his vision and goals. Alexander found himself surprised by the depth of her insights. She understood not just the practical challenges facing families in medical crisis, but the emotional and psychological aspects that most philanthropic efforts completely missed. Many programs make people feel like beggars, Elena observed. They require you to prove your worthiness, to detail your suffering for committees of strangers. The help comes with shame attached, which makes it almost worse than no help at all. Exactly, Alexander said, feeling a genuine excitement he hadn't experienced in years. What if we could create something different? What if we could find ways to help that felt like partnership rather than charity? Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying Alexander's face. Alex, why is this so important to you? You seem invested in this in a very personal way. The honesty in her question caught Alexander off guard. He thought about his carefully prepared backstory, but looking into Elena's eyes, he found himself sharing something much more real. Because I've spent my whole life accumulating wealth and power, but I've never felt as useful as I did the day I met Sofia in the rain, he said quietly. You and your daughter taught me something I'd forgotten, that the most important problems can't be solved with money alone. They require understanding, respect, and genuine human connection. Elena smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, Alexander saw her carefully maintained composure soften slightly. I would be honored to help you with this project, Alex, and I think my experience might be exactly what you need. As Alexander left Elena's apartment that evening, he carried with him something more valuable than any business contract he'd ever signed: Elena's trust, Sofia's excitement about the project, and the strange new feeling that for the first time in years he was exactly where he was supposed to be, but the deception weighed on him. As much as he treasured Elena's respect, he knew that building a relationship on lies, even well-intentioned ones, was dangerous territory. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and when it did, everything they were building together would be at risk. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the gleaming lobby of Northwestern Memorial Hospital's newly opened Hayes Family Medical Support Center, watching as families who couldn't afford treatment received care with dignity and respect. The foundation that had started as a deception to help one family had grown into something remarkable, a comprehensive program that Elena had helped design from the ground up. But Elena wasn't there to see the dedication ceremony. 3 weeks earlier, her condition had taken a sudden turn for the worse, and she was back in room 847, the same room where Alexander had first met her. The experimental treatment that the foundation had quietly arranged, presented as a clinical trial opportunity rather than charity, had bought her precious months with Sofia. But the leukemia was winning. Alexander found Sofia sitting in the hospital cafeteria, mechanically eating a sandwich that Mrs. Garcia had packed for her. At 9 years old now, she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders. Mr. Alex, Sofia said, looking up with tired eyes that had seen too much. Mama wants to see you. She says she has something important to tell you. Alexander's heart clenched as he followed Sofia back to the 8th floor. Over the past 6 months, he and Elena had worked together almost daily, designing programs that had already helped over 200 families. She had become his closest advisor, his moral compass, and if he was honest with himself, one of the most important people in his life. The thought of losing her felt like losing a piece of his soul. Room 847 looked different this time. Elena was obviously weaker, but her eyes still held that familiar spark of determination. When she saw Alexander, she smiled with genuine warmth. Alex, sit down. We need to talk. Alexander settled into the chair beside her bed, the same chair where he'd sat countless times over the past months as they planned the foundation together. I know who you really are, Elena said gently, reaching for his hand. I've known for a while now. Alexander's blood ran cold. Elena, I can explain. Alexander Hayes, she continued, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. Billionaire. CEO of Hayes Technologies. The man who built a medical foundation and hired a dying woman to help him understand how to use his wealth responsibly. Alexander hung his head, shame washing over him. I'm sorry. I lied to you because I knew you wouldn't accept help from someone like me. I just wanted to save my life, Elena finished. And in the process, you saved your own. Alexander looked up, confused by her calm tone. Elena smiled. Alex, do you think I didn't recognize the man whose picture was on the wall of this very hospital? The Hayes Wing, the Hayes Foundation, the Hayes Medical Research Center? You were hiding in plain sight. Then why didn't you say anything? Because, Elena said, her voice growing softer, you needed to learn how to be just Alex before you could figure out how to be Alexander Hayes. You needed to understand what it felt like to be valued for your heart rather than your bank account. Tears. Alexander didn't know he was capable of began flowing down his cheeks. Elena, I've never felt as alive as I have these past 6 months. Working with you, building something that actually matters, it's the first time my life has had real purpose. And that's your answer, Elena whispered. You asked me once how to help people without taking away their dignity. The secret isn't in how you give, it's in how you see. You learned to see me as Elena, the mother, the consultant, the partner. Before you saw me as Elena, the cancer patient who needed saving. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. Alexander recognized him as one of the oncologists who had been working with Elena since the beginning. I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Martinez said quietly, but Mrs. Morales, we need to discuss the next steps for Sofia's care arrangements. Elena looked between Alexander and the doctor. Actually, there's something I need to tell both of you. She reached into her bedside table and pulled out a manila envelope. Alex, inside this envelope are all the legal documents making you Sofia's guardian, if you're willing. I've been planning this for months. Alexander's heart stopped. Elena, Sofia needs someone who will love her unconditionally, who will teach her that wealth isn't about money, but about how much you can give to others. She needs someone who understands that the greatest privilege isn't what you can buy, but what you can build. Dr. Martinez wiped his eyes as Alexander took the envelope with shaking hands. Will you take care of my daughter? Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. For the rest of my life, Alexander promised, his voice breaking. Elena passed away peacefully 2 days later, with Alexander and Sofia holding her hands. 1 year later, Alexander sat in his renovated penthouse now filled with Sofia's artwork, family photos, and the comfortable chaos of a home where a child was loved. The Hayes Family Medical Support Center had expanded to 5 cities, helping thousands of families facing medical crises with dignity and respect. Sofia, now 10, was curled up beside him on the couch, reading one of the many books that now filled his formerly sterile apartment. Papa Alex, Sofia said, using the name she'd started calling him months earlier. Do you think Mama knows about all the families we're helping? Alexander pulled her closer, thinking about Elena's wisdom that had shaped everything they'd built together. I think she knows, Mia. And I think she's proud that we learned her most important lesson. What lesson? That the richest people aren't the ones with the most money. They're the ones who have the most love to give. Sofia smiled and returned to her book. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago sparkled in the evening light, but Alexander's attention was focused on the small girl beside him who had taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in billions, but in the simple privilege of being needed, of being loved, and of having someone to love in return. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest fortunes come disguised as the deepest losses. Sometimes the people who seem to need saving end up being the ones who save us. And sometimes, a desperate question asked by a little girl in the rain can transform not just one life, but hundreds of lives, creating ripples of compassion that spread far beyond anything money alone could ever accomplish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.